Hi everyone, this is Karen Potts from Hands and Voices, and today I have a little special guest with us, and it's Irene Taylor Brodsky. And her and I we met on a train years ago. I remember it not so much, probably as not many people. She's a filmmaker, and she's made some really unique films. And the most recent one released is what is that? Moonlight Sonata, Deafness in three movements. I'm not even sure how we would sign that. So, Irene, welcome.
Thanks.
So, I think we'll start off. You tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you're a child of deaf parents. We both had agreed that we would start off signing and then skip and switch to spoken English and then adding the caption just so it's easier. It's kind of hard to sign and speak at the same time.
hmm Yeah, I'm a coda. That means for me, I'm very used to signing with one hand, very sloppy. So if people are depending on my signs, maybe it won't be that clear. So I'm just going to use my voice, English only, and then
Mhm.
I think captions might be best for the viewers.
Sounds good. Okay, so tell us a little bit about yourself, growing up a child of deaf parents and then becoming a parent yourself.
Yeah. So I grew up in the 70s and the 80s with deaf parents who both did not learn how to sign until they were in their teenage years. And so as a young child, I was spoken to a lot and I spoke to them and I learned how to speak to them in a way that they could understand me. As a child, I do not have one memory, truly, I do not have one memory of my mother and father misunderstanding me. They always understood me. We always had very clear communication, but until I was about 5 or 6, it was mostly oral. And then my parents were getting very involved in the deaf community as adults and eventually moved to Rochester, and I grew up basically on the campus of NTID. So as a middle schooler and high schooler, then I was surrounded by sign language. And even though my parents had not been signing with us at home, when I was in church, when I was on the campus, when I was with their friends, whenever their deaf friends would come over for dinner, everyone was signing. So I grew up around sign language, even though my parents' native language was spoken English.
Mhm. So, for you, when you became a parent yourself, tell me a little bit about that journey of becoming a mom of Jonas.
Mm-hmm. So when Jonas was born, he had a newborn hearing screening, which is something they do by law here in Oregon. And the hearing test did not indicate that he had any hearing problems. We always knew that we might have a hearing child, but there are other grandkids in my family, and my son was the eighth child to be born, and everyone before him was hearing. So while we would not have been surprised if he was deaf, we also were not surprised that he was hearing. What happened though is about 18 months into his life, his doctor noticed that he wasn't developing language on par with his peers. And so she sent us to the audiologist to get some hearing tests done, and we realized that he had profound high frequency hearing loss. So he was hearing low sounds, but he wasn't hearing high frequency sounds, which explained why he could hear us when we called his name, and he would look at us when we called him, and he was even babbling some words, but he was just babbling these very dysfunctional patterns of speech the way he heard them. You know, any deaf kid is going to speak what they hear. And if they don't hear anything, they're not going to speak. And if they hear a little, they're going to speak it in whatever way they're hearing it. So he was only hearing language below maybe 750 hertz, for those of you who understand the way the audiogram works.
Audiogram.
So it was very shocking to us because we just assumed he could hear us. He could hear us, but he could only hear a tiny fraction of language.
And do you think, well, tell me a little bit about your own feelings at that point of getting a diagnosis. What were you going through? What were you feeling?
So even though I am very comfortable around the deaf experience and I feel very intuitive about it, about having friends and family who are deaf, I was very surprised how emotionally upset I felt when I found out Jonas was losing his hearing. And I think the reason why I felt upset was because the deafness I knew was deafness from another generation. It was deafness in the 40s and 50s and what educating a deaf kid was like then. It was around being around deaf adults, but I didn't know deaf kids that much. And I didn't know what the law was, and I didn't know what the opportunities were, and I didn't know how I felt about what kind of school to put him in, and if I wanted to have him have cochlear implant surgery. Like, I'd never thought about it in the context of my own child. I'd watched my parents get cochlear implants in their 60s, and that was a completely different experience, and I knew my child would have a different experience than they had. So I just felt ill-equipped. I wasn't afraid of deafness, but I just felt ill-equipped how to deal with it in the 21st century with a child in today's landscape of education, the legal landscape, the technology landscape. So it was still a very emotional experience for me. And I was also working through this with my husband, who's a physician. And even though he knows my parents, he didn't know sign language. He didn't have many deaf friends. He didn't really know much about deafness. So I was also kind of playing a guide to him while at the same time grappling with my own feelings of, oh my God, can I handle this? Can I actually do this on my own? So that was hard.
What do you think helped you get into a place of confidence so that you can make the decisions that you made for your child? What got you into that place of confidence in making decisions?
Mm-hmm. I'm an information person. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a journalist by training. For me, information is power. So I just started talking to everyone and their brother about what to do. And I signed him up in a early intervention program with a sign language instructor. I signed him up with the oral program, both, 2 different modalities. I took him to parent groups with deaf kids. I met deaf parents. I met hearing parents. I was just looking for community across every modality, every demographic. I was wanting to be with people who had the resources to send their kids to certain private programs, and I wanted to be with families who were working entirely in the public system and did not have disposable income for extra tutoring or speech therapy, because I knew it was very important for me to understand a very holistic way to approach educating and raising a deaf kid. We ultimately decided to give Jonas 1 cochlear implant when he was 4, and then we gave him the second one when he was 8. And that was because we realized that even though he was getting a lot of information through the one side, he was having trouble locating sound. He also expressed a lot of interest in music, and he started playing the piano when he was 5 years old, about a year after he got the implant. And several surgeons told us that his music perception, he would have more nuanced perspective on sound if he had dual implants. So we decided to get the second one at 8. But really, I would say information is what gave me power. And whenever I met parents along the way who maybe didn't follow my path, or maybe even told me out loud they didn't agree with my choices, I told them I respected their choices and that we were moving as a family and just making the choices that made the most sense for us. And I will say that my deaf parents really stood back and said, this is your choice. However you want to educate him, whether you want to implant him with technology, we will support you, whatever you choose. And I think that the more I heard that from people, the more empowered I felt to follow my own gut as a parent and as a human being, really. I mean, it's a human choice. And I will also just add that we have a lot of musicians in our family on both sides, my husband's side and my side. And we really wanted to give Jonas access not only to language, but to music. And that kind of tipped the scale, if you will. We weren't just thinking like, do we want our kid to talk or sign? We wanted our kid to do both. And we wanted our kid to experience living in a sound-filled world. And we knew that there would be complications that came with that. But we ultimately decided that in our family, that would be the best way to move forward.
It sounds very similar to the Hands and Voices philosophy of whatever works for your child is what makes the choice right. Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about music, and you had that brand new movie that's coming out, and it's coming out on HBO next year. So tell me about how you got the idea for that movie and how this all came about.
Well, first of all, the film Moonlight Sonata, hold on, there's noise. The film Moonlight Sonata sorry, it's very noisy. The film is releasing in theaters around the country starting this weekend. Mm-hmm. So we're actually wanting to tell people about it because it might be coming to their city. We're coming to big cities, we're coming to small cities, and we have a website, Moonlight Sonata doc.com. And that lists all the places we'll be screening. And so the film is going to be publicly available all of this fall, and then it will go on HBO towards the end of this year. So, thank you. So it's really important that as soon as people learn about this film, that they talk about it and tell their friends, because I don't want people to miss it when it comes to their community. Mm-hmm. We can always watch it on HBO, but it's much more valuable to watch it with a community of parents or a community of people, because then there's dialogue around it. But basically, the film came about when Jonas was 11 years old. He told me he wanted to play on the piano a famous piece of music called the Moonlight Sonata. There's 3 movements or 3 chapters or verses, you could say, of the song, of this composition. And he wanted to learn the first movement, which for people who can hear music, it's probably one they're going to recognize. It's a very recognizable piece of classical music. The second and the third movement are not as recognizable. They're also very, very hard. So the first movement, he wanted to learn it. And because I'm a filmmaker, I decided that I would start filming him learning the song, because I realized very quickly that there was an incredible story behind the writing of this piece. And that story goes like this. Beethoven was a famous composer and pianist, and in his 20s, he started developing hearing loss and ringing and all sorts of discomfort around his hearing. He went into a deep depression because it was affecting the way he wrote music and the way he was playing music on the piano in his performances. This was in the late 1700s. He survived a suicidal depression that he went through for quite some time. And as he was coming out of that depression, he decided to take claim of his life and move forward, even with these problems with his hearing, because hearing was everything to him. He was a musician. And the first piece he wrote was the Moonlight Sonata. So I really thought that the poetic coincidence of this was just too great not to try to render some kind of story out of it. So I started filming Jonas and eventually realized that there was this whole universe that I could document as a filmmaker that would really talk about the deaf experience and how it's evolved from the 19th century to the 20th century and into the 21st century, because Beethoven wrote the Moonlight Sonata around 1801. So basically, I was able to focus on a deaf person from the 1800s, a deaf person from the 1900s, which is Jonas's grandparents, my parents, and Jonas himself, who's what I'd call, a 21st century deaf kid with all of these technologies available to him if he uses them.
3 different perspectives. And I guess for you also as a daughter, tell me about what it's been like to capture some of your father's story in this.
So I always knew that my parents would be a part of any film I made about Jonas because they're a huge part of our life. They live 2 blocks away. And we're sort of like we have a shared family life. We eat dinner together all the time. So I was really expecting that my parents would be a part of the film. But about halfway through making the film, my father started experiencing his own loss. Much like Beethoven was losing what was the most important to him, my father started losing his grasp on his own mind. He was developing dementia. And so that became a part of our story. And we felt it was very valuable for us to look at 2 things. One is, because we were making this movie about this beautiful piece of music, about a composer who had lost something that he had, and he was grappling with how to handle that. We thought that Paul's loss might shed some insight into Beethoven's loss. We thought it might help people understand what it's like to be blindsided by something. When you have lived your whole life with hearing or lived your whole life with a very powerful mind, what does it feel like to realize, not suddenly, but slowly, that you're losing your grasp on the very thing that makes you who you are? So we included Paul for that reason. Another reason I included him was I realized that as a deaf older adult, my father was facing challenges that are unique to deaf people. And that is that he has always had a problem with isolation. Most deaf people, even if they have very proficient modalities, isolation is a matter of fact. It's a matter of circumstance. Deaf people get left out of conversation. They get left out of public dialogue. And here was my father already suffering that isolation because he's deaf. And then on top of that, he was losing his faculties to communicate, to lip read, to understand sign language. And we knew that if we put him in a facility with other people who had dementia, there was a very little chance that anyone would know how to communicate with him effectively. So one of the things that I hope in the long run this film can do is really activate the public health community around deaf seniors and how we can better help deaf adults as they age, because they have very particular problems around aging.
Those are tough issues, especially as we age, we're facing more and more challenges. In the making of this film, what was the most surprising lesson for you that came out of the whole thing?
Well, I think the most surprising thing was how much my father became the heart and soul of the film. I thought this was going to be a film about a deaf kid and a famous deaf composer. And ultimately, the film was still about them. But the heart and soul of the film was really the man in the middle of the two of them. The man who lived a full life as a deaf person. And you get to know him in this film as a child. You get to know what he went through. So you see my father as a deaf child back in the 1940s and 50s. And I think the thing that surprised me was how much understanding and texture we can really glean from the deaf experience if we look at it in a continuum over time. I think we beat ourselves up a lot for, well, I don't want to say we beat ourselves up. I think sometimes we beat each other up about decisions on communication, on modalities of communication, on what we label ourselves. Am I culturally deaf? Do I identify as a deaf cultural person? And we get caught up in all of these labels that really, I think, belittle how dynamic we truly are as deaf people and the families of deaf people. I think every child is unique. Every family is unique. And what really surprised me was how much, by focusing on these deaf characters from 300 years of history, I hope that I was really able to point out that we don't need to be so black and white about how we identify ourselves and the choices we make. Jonas has implants, but I will tell you, he takes them off all the time. And when he's at home, he likes to chill out, do his homework without them. He likes to sign with me instead of speaking with me. But when he goes to school, he wears them. When he plays piano, he usually wears them, but he often takes them off. So how do you define that? That's beyond definition. That defies culturally deaf. That's not oral. That's not manual. That's something messy and in between. And I think that moving forward, that's what I hope we can all embrace, is that life is messy. Who we are, it's a little convoluted. We change our minds. We grow. We evolve. What we thought when we're 30 as a parent may not be what we think when we're 50 as a grandparent, and so I just hope that we'll take it easy on ourselves. And to the extent that people do still get on one another or get after one another or worry about, am I deaf enough, or am I giving my child enough access to hearing? Stop being so afraid and just doing what feels intuitively right. And eventually those kids will grow up and they will feel the confidence that we gave them. And they will make that decision for themselves, and they will feel good about themselves, and they won't feel guilty because they're one way or another way. They'll feel like, I'm who I am, and I'm hoping that, that's what Jonas can be. And I think the surprise is really just how much, if you just trust the individual choice, it makes everything a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And I found a quote from you that I think will wrap this up as well. And when I read this quote, I was like, wow, spot on. And it says, Julie, actually, you said, what's perceived as a deficiency or a weakness can actually be our greatest strength. And I think from what I've seen from the trailer of the movie, you talk about that, about how being deaf, being hard of hearing actually becomes a strength. You know, we just talked about Jonas and how he sometimes takes his implants off to play music as well. And that's what Beethoven did. And the challenge that your father's going through right now, sometimes that brings out the strength in all of us. So I thought that quote really wraps up what the movie is also about. The documentary is about how our deficiencies or weakness, what's perceived as that, actually can become our greatest strength.
Well, I think any of us who know someone who is called deaf, we understand that because we know how strong that kid is. And even if in medical literature that can be seen or defined as a limitation, we know it
Mm-hmm.
can be a strength. And we have to teach our kids that, their deafness can be a superpower. Jonas,
Yeah.
one of the things we talk about in the film is Jonas realizes from his grandfather, if he's hearing something he doesn't want to hear, he could just turn it off. And that's a superpower most people don't have. So now Jonas does it too. So
It's a great superpower when you're flying on an airplane and the kid behind you is screaming.
that's
You're
right.
fine.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
Thank you so much for
Thank you
sharing
so
in
much.
this. And I
Okay.
really look forward to seeing the documentary.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. Bye.
Hold on. Stop recording and I'll